What if you discovered that your entire family life was built on a lie? Imagine walking into a world where everything you held dear, your marriage, your children, your very identity as a parent, was a carefully woven tapestry of betrayal. For Officer Mark Lawson, a man known for upholding justice and protecting others, this nightmare became his reality. But the shocking twist? The betrayal didn't come from a stranger, it came from someone he had trusted implicitly, someone he called family. Mark Lawson, a 42-year-old police officer, was a man who seemed to have it all: a beautiful wife, Natalie, 4 incredible children, and a respected career in law enforcement. In his community, Mark was a symbol of fairness and integrity, a protector in every sense of the word. He was the kind of man people turned to in times of trouble, the anchor in storms of chaos. Yet, the strongest anchors can still be pulled under by a tidal wave of betrayal. Mark's world began to unravel on an otherwise ordinary day. It wasn't the criminals he pursued or the dangers of his job that brought his life to a standstill. It was a revelation so devastating it would tear apart everything he believed about love, loyalty, and family. The quiet home he had built with Natalie, his sanctuary, was about to become the setting for a tragedy that would shock everyone who knew them. This is the story of a betrayal so intimate and unimaginable, it led to heartbreak, violence, and the complete destruction of a family. But what makes this story even more chilling is the person at the heart of the betrayal: Mark's father-in-law, Richard Bennett, a man Mark had respected, admired, and trusted with his life. Before we dive into the twisted details of this case, make sure to like this video and subscribe. This one will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust, love, and family. Mark met Natalie 17 years ago at a police charity event. She was dazzling, with a smile that could brighten even the darkest room. At 21, Natalie seemed like the perfect partner, compassionate, supportive, and grounded. Mark, a young officer eager to make a difference, fell head over heels. Their relationship blossomed quickly, and within 2 years, they were married. Natalie soon became the mother of 4 children who were the pride and joy of Mark's life. Mark believed he had everything he ever wanted. His life revolved around his family, and he wore his role as a husband and father like a badge of honor. But beneath the surface, Natalie was harboring secrets that would eventually tear their family apart. Richard Bennett, Natalie's father, was a larger-than-life figure in Mark's world. A retired firefighter, Richard was charismatic, witty, and deeply involved in his community. He had a way of making everyone feel special, a trait that had earned him universal admiration. To Mark, Richard was not just a father-in-law, he was a mentor, a man he could confide in, and a grandfather his children adored. But Richard had a dark side, one that would eventually come to light in the most horrifying way. Beneath his charming facade lay a manipulative streak, a man willing to cross unthinkable boundaries to satisfy his desires. The cracks in Mark's perfect life began to show when his youngest child, Liam, fell seriously ill. Doctors needed to run genetic tests to determine the cause, and Mark and Natalie were asked to provide their DNA. What should have been a routine process turned into a nightmare when the results came back. Mark was not the biological father of any of his 4 children. Confusion quickly turned to suspicion. Mark demanded answers from Natalie, but her initial denials and evasions only fueled his anger. Desperate for the truth, Mark delved deeper, hiring a private investigator and conducting additional DNA tests. What he uncovered was beyond anything he could have imagined. Natalie tearfully admitted that her father, Richard, had been more than just a father to her. The man Mark had respected and welcomed into his home had been sexually abusing Natalie for years, long before she had met Mark. Even more horrifying, Richard was the biological father of all 4 of Mark's children. For Mark, the revelation was like a bomb detonating in his life. His marriage was a lie, his children were not his own, and the man he had trusted most had violated not just his wife, but also the sanctity of their family. Mark's sense of betrayal quickly turned into a blinding rage. He confronted Natalie, demanding to know why she hadn't come forward sooner. Her tearful explanations only deepened his despair. When Mark finally confronted Richard, the situation spiraled out of control. According to witnesses, the confrontation escalated into a heated argument that quickly turned violent. Mark, overwhelmed by years of betrayal and pain, lost control. By the time the police arrived, both Natalie and Richard were dead, and Mark was sitting on the floor, covered in blood, cradling a family photo. The case sent shockwaves through the community. Mark, once a respected officer, was now behind bars, awaiting trial for a double homicide. The children, now orphaned, were placed into foster care, their lives forever altered by the actions of the adults they had trusted most. The tragedy of Mark Lawson's story lies not just in the horrific acts that were uncovered, but in the devastating ripple effects those acts had on everyone involved. A man who had dedicated his life to protecting others had become the victim of a betrayal so profound, it destroyed him and everyone he loved. This story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from the outside but from within the walls of your own home. Though Natalie barely noticed her father-in-law, Richard Bennett, during the early days of her relationship with Mark Lawson, the dynamics between them took a dark turn years later. Mark, oblivious to the undercurrents in his family, had brought Natalie home with pride to introduce her to his closest circle. Richard, ever the charming and larger-than-life figure, greeted her warmly. But unbeknownst to Mark, a spark of recognition flickered in Natalie's eyes, a trace of unease she quickly masked with a smile. Mark had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. To him, his father-in-law's attention to Natalie seemed like nothing more than familial affection. Richard's jovial demeanor and frequent visits only reinforced the perception of a close-knit family. Yet behind closed doors, Richard was weaving a web of manipulation, exploiting vulnerabilities in a way that would devastate everyone involved. The bond between Richard and Natalie began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Richard, who had always been a commanding presence in any room, found ways to linger during family gatherings. He complimented Natalie more than seemed necessary, his words laced with a charm that made her uncomfortable but unsure of how to confront it. Natalie, a young mother juggling the demands of raising 4 children and supporting a husband whose career often kept him away, felt isolated and overwhelmed. Richard noticed. He noticed the way her shoulders slumped after a long day, the fatigue she tried to hide behind a polite smile. He began to offer her help, watching the kids, fixing things around the house, and lending a sympathetic ear. What started as seemingly harmless gestures of support soon turned into something far more sinister. Richard was a master manipulator, skilled at identifying and exploiting emotional weaknesses. For Natalie, who was struggling to keep up with the demands of her life, Richard's attention felt like a lifeline. She justified his growing presence in their lives as an act of kindness, a way for her father-in-law to stay involved with his grandchildren. But the line between support and seduction blurred rapidly. It began with lingering glances, a touch on her arm that lasted a moment too long, and compliments that made her feel both seen and uncomfortable. Natalie told herself it was innocent, even as a part of her knew otherwise. Over time, Richard's actions became bolder. He started visiting when Mark wasn't home, offering to help with errands or just check in on her and the kids. His presence, once reassuring, began to feel invasive. One evening, while Mark was working late, Richard showed up unannounced. Natalie, caught off guard, invited him in. As the evening wore on, the tension between them became palpable. Richard's charm turned predatory, and Natalie found herself unable to resist his advances. What happened that night marked the beginning of a secret that would unravel their family and destroy their lives. The affair between Natalie and Richard continued in the shadows, hidden beneath the facade of a happy family. Richard's manipulation kept Natalie trapped in a cycle of guilt and silence. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but fear and shame kept her from confessing. Richard, for his part, reveled in the power he held over her. Family gatherings became opportunities for stolen moments. A lingering glance across the room, a whispered conversation in the kitchen, or a touch disguised as an accident, all of it went unnoticed by Mark, who trusted both his wife and his father-in-law implicitly. Richard's charm extended to everyone, making it nearly impossible for Natalie to break free from his grasp. As the years passed, Natalie gave birth to 4 children. Mark adored them, pouring every ounce of his love and energy into being the best father he could. He saw himself in their smiles, their quirks, and their dreams. What he didn't know was that none of them were biologically his. Richard, the man he respected and admired, was their real father. The weight of this secret became unbearable for Natalie, but she couldn't bring herself to reveal the truth. Every time she looked at her children, she saw the devastating consequences of her betrayal. Yet, she clung to the hope that the truth would never come out, that her family could somehow remain intact. The facade of their perfect family began to crack when their youngest child, Emma, fell seriously ill. Doctors requested DNA samples from both parents to assess potential genetic markers. Natalie's heart sank, but she couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. When the results came back, Mark's world came crashing down. The DNA test revealed that he was not the biological father of any of his children. Confused and betrayed, Mark confronted Natalie, demanding answers. She broke down under the weight of her guilt, confessing everything: the affair with Richard, the years of lies, and the truth about the children. Blinded by rage and heartbreak, Mark sought out Richard. The confrontation was explosive. Years of resentment and betrayal boiled over, and Mark, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, lost control. The argument escalated into a violent altercation, and in a fit of uncontrollable anger, Mark shot Richard. Natalie, who tried to intervene, was caught in the chaos and met the same fate. When the police arrived, they found Mark sitting in the living room, cradling a photo of his family, his face a mask of grief and despair. He was arrested without resistance, his once pristine reputation now in tatters. The children, now orphaned, were placed in the care of social services, their lives forever scarred by the actions of the adults they had trusted most. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community, leaving everyone questioning how such darkness could exist within a family that seemed so perfect. Mark Lawson's story is a haunting reminder of the devastating consequences of betrayal and the fragile nature of trust. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about love, loyalty, and the lengths to which people will go to hide their darkest secrets. Mark Lawson had always been a man who believed in the truth. As a police officer, his career was built on uncovering lies, seeking justice, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But nothing could have prepared him for the betrayal that was unfolding within the walls of his own home, a betrayal so profound, it would turn his life upside down. While Mark devoted his days to providing for his family, Natalie and Richard Bennett, his father-in-law, were creating their own twisted bond. What started as innocent gestures of support and affection quickly escalated into a full-blown affair, hidden in plain sight. They found ways to communicate, ways to be alone, ways to carry on their relationship without raising suspicion. But no secret stays hidden forever. For years, Mark was blissfully unaware of the betrayal happening right under his nose. He adored his wife, Natalie, and his 4 children, pouring his heart and soul into creating a life of stability and love. He trusted Natalie implicitly and viewed Richard as a second father, a man who had been a pillar of support throughout their marriage. But then, a single, offhand comment shattered the illusion of perfection. One evening during dinner, Natalie casually mentioned how much their youngest child, Emma, resembled Richard. It was meant as a light-hearted remark, but something about the way she said it struck a chord deep within Mark. At first, he brushed it off, dismissing it as a coincidence. But the thought lingered, nagging at the edges of his mind. Mark began to notice other things, subtle, seemingly insignificant details that now felt glaring. The way Natalie seemed overly attentive to Richard when he visited, the way Richard's compliments toward Natalie always felt a little too personal. The unease grew, and Mark's instincts as a police officer kicked in. He couldn't ignore the signs, no matter how much he wanted to. Determined to put his doubts to rest, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he researched how to conduct a DNA test discreetly. He ordered a home kit, having it delivered to a friend's address to avoid arousing suspicion. When the kit arrived, Mark carefully planned how to collect the samples. He waited for moments when the children were distracted, taking strands of hair from their hairbrushes and storing them in sealed bags. For his own sample, he used a cotton swab and secured it alongside theirs. The wait for the results was agonizing. Mark found himself scrutinizing every interaction between Natalie and Richard, his suspicions growing with each passing day. When the envelope finally arrived, he sat in his car for hours, staring at it, too afraid to open it. Deep down, he already knew the truth. When he finally tore open the envelope, the words confirmed his worst fears: none of the children were biologically his. The revelation hit Mark like a freight train. He felt a mix of emotions: rage, heartbreak, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. But more than anything, he felt a need for answers. That night, he confronted Natalie. His voice was trembling, his hands clenched into fists as he demanded the truth. At first, Natalie denied everything, insisting there had to be a mistake. But Mark's persistence wore her down. Finally, in a torrent of tears, she confessed. She admitted to the affair, revealing that Richard, her own father, was the biological father of all 4 children. Mark was stunned. The betrayal was far worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just about infidelity, it was about a violation so profound, it defied comprehension. He felt like his entire life had been a lie, the foundation of his family built on a grotesque secret. Fueled by a mix of rage and heartbreak, Mark decided to confront Richard. He drove to his father-in-law's house, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. When Richard answered the door, Mark wasted no time. He demanded an explanation, shouting accusations and throwing punches before Richard could utter a word. The confrontation quickly escalated into a violent struggle. Richard, who had always been physically imposing, fought back, but Mark's rage made him unstoppable. In the chaos, Mark grabbed a nearby object, a heavy lamp, and struck Richard repeatedly. When the dust settled, Richard lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling around him. Natalie, who had followed Mark to Richard's house, tried to intervene, begging Mark to stop. But her pleas only fueled his anger. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Mark turned on her. The betrayal, the lies, the years of deceit, it all came crashing down in a moment of blind fury. When the police arrived, they found Mark sitting on the floor, cradling a family photo. His hands were covered in blood, his face blank with shock. He didn't resist arrest, offering no explanation for what had happened. The once respected officer, known for his calm demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice, was now the prime suspect in a double homicide. The community was left reeling. How could a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others commit such a horrific act? As the details of the case emerged, the public was divided. Some saw Mark as a victim of unimaginable betrayal, while others viewed him as a cold-blooded killer. The children, now orphaned, were placed in foster care, their lives forever scarred by the actions of the adults they trusted most. Mark's trial became a media sensation, with every sordid detail splashed across headlines. The story of love, betrayal, and murder captivated the nation, leaving everyone questioning the limits of loyalty and the depths of human despair. Mark Lawson's story is a haunting reminder that the greatest betrayals often come from those closest to us. It's a story of love twisted into something unrecognizable, of trust shattered beyond repair, and of a man pushed to the brink by the weight of betrayal. As Mark sits in his prison cell, replaying the events that led to that fateful night, one question remains: could things have turned out differently if the truth had come out sooner? Or was this tragedy inevitable, the result of secrets too dark to stay hidden? This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, loyalty, and the devastating consequences of betrayal. It serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. The sound of gunshots shattered the stillness of the night, ricocheting through the Lawson household like a bolt of lightning. For years, the house had been a sanctuary for Mark Lawson, a place where he felt safe, surrounded by the family he had worked so hard to provide for. But on this night, that sanctuary had become the epicenter of a tragedy no one could have foreseen. The Lawson children were jolted awake by the deafening blasts. Malik, the eldest at 15, was the first to react. His instincts kicked in as he leapt from his bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew something terrible had happened, but he couldn't yet comprehend the full extent of it. His younger siblings, Emma, Jackson, and Lily, huddled together in their rooms, too frightened to move. Malik crept down the hallway, his steps hesitant, the air thick with dread. As he reached the top of the stairs, he heard his father's heavy breathing coming from the master bedroom. The door was ajar, and what he saw when he peeked inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mark stood frozen in the center of the room, his firearm still clutched in his trembling hands. Blood spattered the walls and the bed, a gruesome testament to the violence that had just unfolded. Natalie and Richard lay lifeless on the bed, their faces pale, their bodies still. Malik's gasp broke the silence, and Mark turned sharply, his eyes wild and unfocused. For a moment, father and son locked eyes, and in that moment, Malik saw the pain and regret etched into his father's face. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he dropped the gun to the floor with a hollow clatter and sank to his knees. Malik rushed to his siblings, pulling them from their rooms and ushering them downstairs. He didn't know what to do, but he knew they needed to get out of the house. The children clung to each other, their faces pale with fear as they huddled in the living room. "I'll protect you," Malik whispered, his voice shaking as he tried to reassure them. But how could he protect them when their protector, their father, had just torn their world apart? The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, and Malik knew help was on the way. He held his siblings close, trying to shield them from the horrors unfolding upstairs. When the police arrived, Mark was still kneeling in the bedroom, staring at the lifeless bodies of his wife and father-in-law. He didn't resist as the officers handcuffed him, his expression blank and unresponsive. He was a man utterly broken, his world destroyed by the weight of betrayal and the violence it had unleashed. The officers led him out of the house, past his children, who watched in stunned silence. Malik's eyes filled with tears as he saw his father being taken away, but he didn't move or speak. The weight of what had happened was too much for him to process. The story of Mark Lawson's crime spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and sparking outrage across the nation. A respected police officer turned murderer, a shocking betrayal within a seemingly perfect family, and the devastating consequences of secrets long buried. It was a tale that captivated and horrified the public in equal measure. Neighbors and friends struggled to reconcile the Mark they knew, a man of integrity and kindness, with the man who had committed such a heinous act. Speculation ran rampant as details of the affair between Natalie and Richard began to emerge. The public sympathy for Mark was mixed. While some saw him as a victim driven to the brink by unimaginable betrayal, others condemned his actions as a horrifying failure of self-control. In the wake of the tragedy, the Lawson children were placed in foster care. The home they had once known as a place of love and security was now a crime scene, a haunting reminder of the night their lives changed forever. Malik, now thrust into the role of protector, struggled to keep his siblings together. The weight of what he had witnessed and the responsibility he now bore threatened to crush him. The younger children, too young to fully understand the betrayal and violence, clung to him for comfort. Mark's trial was one of the most watched in recent history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and legal experts eager to see how the case would unfold. Mark's defense team argued that he had been pushed to the brink by years of deceit and manipulation, that his actions were the result of temporary insanity brought on by the discovery of the affair and the DNA test results. The prosecution painted a different picture, a man who had let his rage consume him, committing a premeditated double murder. They argued that Mark's role as a police officer meant he knew better than anyone the importance of upholding the law, regardless of personal circumstances. The jury's decision came after weeks of emotional testimony and heart-wrenching revelations. Mark was found guilty of double homicide and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As he was led away, he turned to look at his children, seated in the back of the courtroom. His eyes were filled with tears, but his lips didn't move. There was nothing left to say. The Lawson family's story became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of how secrets, lies, and betrayal can destroy even the strongest bonds. For the children, the scars of that night would never fully heal. And for Mark, the man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, the irony of his own downfall would haunt him for the rest of his days. This story is a chilling exploration of how trust, when broken, can lead to unimaginable consequences. It serves as a stark reminder that the choices we make, no matter how hidden we think they are, can ripple outward, affecting countless lives. Mark Lawson's tragedy forces us to ask ourselves, how far would we go if the very foundation of our lives was built on a lie? And at what cost do we seek the truth? As the sound of sirens grew louder, the Lawson children sat huddled in Malik's room, their muffled sobs filling the air. The once vibrant home, where laughter had once echoed through the halls, was now drenched in silence and fear. Malik, at just 15 years old, felt the weight of responsibility fall squarely on his shoulders. He held his siblings close, whispering reassurances he didn't believe, his own fear barely contained. Downstairs, Mark Lawson sat motionless on the couch, his head in his hands, replaying the events of the past hour in his mind. The regret, the devastation, the overwhelming guilt, it all consumed him, leaving him feeling hollow. The sound of police officers banging on the door pulled him from his trance. Mark walked to the front door, his hands raised. "I'm unarmed," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The officers approached cautiously, their weapons drawn. They placed him in handcuffs, leading him to the patrol car waiting outside. As Mark passed the front window, he looked up and saw Malik standing there, his face pale and pressed against the glass. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, Mark felt a pang of anguish deeper than anything he'd ever known. What could he possibly say to his son? What words could undo what he had just done? The officers placed Mark in the back seat of the patrol car. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the house he had once called home, a house now scarred by tragedy. The neighbors stood on their porches, whispering and pointing, their expressions a mix of shock and confusion. Inside the house, investigators began documenting the scene. The master bedroom was a macabre tableau of shattered trust and irrevocable choices. Richard Bennett's lifeless body lay slumped on the bed, his once confident smirk now replaced by a blank stare. Natalie lay beside him, her face frozen in an expression of shock and terror. Mark's service firearm lay on the floor where he had dropped it, the faint smell of gunpowder still lingering in the air. Blood spattered the walls and sheets, a grim testament to the violence that had unfolded. The investigators moved methodically, photographing the scene, collecting evidence, and noting every detail. But it was the children, huddled together upstairs, that weighed heaviest on everyone's minds. Malik tried to stay strong for his siblings, but the cracks in his composure were beginning to show. Jackson, 10, clung to him, his small hands shaking uncontrollably. 8-year-old Cameron sat on the floor, staring blankly at the wall, while little Emma, just 5 years old, cried softly into her stuffed bear. When social workers arrived to take the children into temporary custody, Malik refused to let go of his siblings. "You can't take us," he said, his voice breaking. "We're all we have left." But the workers, kind yet firm, explained that they had no choice. The siblings were placed together in foster care, but the trauma of that night lingered. Malik, who had always looked up to his father, now wrestled with feelings of betrayal and abandonment. Jackson and Cameron, too young to fully understand the complexities of what had happened, often woke up screaming from nightmares. Emma, the youngest, withdrew into herself, her once bright smile now a rare sight. Mark's trial became a media spectacle, drawing national attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers. The prosecution painted Mark as a cold-blooded killer, arguing that his role as a police officer made his actions even more heinous. They presented the DNA test results, the evidence of the affair, and the details of the crime scene in painstaking detail. The defense, however, argued that Mark had been pushed to the brink by years of betrayal and manipulation. His attorney described the psychological toll of discovering that his father-in-law had fathered his 4 children and the devastating impact of walking in on Natalie and Richard together. They pleaded for leniency, citing Mark's exemplary career and the extreme emotional distress he had endured. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Mark stood, his hands trembling, as the verdict was read, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led out of the courtroom, Mark looked over his shoulder at his children, who sat in the back row with their foster parents. His eyes filled with tears, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The Lawson children were left to grapple with the fallout of their father's actions. Therapy became a regular part of their lives as they tried to process the trauma and find a way to move forward. Malik, burdened with the weight of his new role as protector, struggled to hold his family together. The community, once united in admiration for Mark Lawson, was now divided. Some saw him as a man who had been pushed too far, a victim of unimaginable betrayal. Others viewed him as a murderer who had let his rage destroy his family. The Lawson family's tragedy became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how secrets and betrayal can tear a family apart. For the children, the scars of that night would never fully heal. And for Mark, now sitting in a prison cell, the echoes of his choices would haunt him for the rest of his life. This is not just a story of betrayal and murder. It's a story of the fragile bonds that hold families together, and how easily they can be shattered when trust is broken. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about love, loyalty, and the devastating consequences of keeping secrets. And it's a story that reminds us, above all, that no one emerges unscathed from the ripple effects of betrayal.